Hello, everyone. Today we'll be discussing Lorenzo da Ponte. He was an Italian librettist. He was a librettist for Mozart, and he led an insane life. So let's get into it. He's born in 1749, March 10th, as Emanuel Coneglio. In Sinada, a small town in the state of Venice, because this is when cities were states in Italy before one unified Italy. He was the son of a tanner. He was born Jewish. His mother died of childbirth, and in 1763, his father remarried to an 18-year-old Catholic girl, and so he converted the entire family to Catholicism. And that's where Emmanuel became Lorenzo da Ponte. He took his name from the bishop who sponsored and baptized him, as was customary for the time. The new woman had 10 children, and Lorenzo was shipped off to the seminary to become a Catholic priest. Because he was bright and he had the sponsorship from the bishop. This is where he starts to write poetry, and he learns to read in Italian literature, and he learns to read Latin, and learns all that good jazz. He graduates as a priest in 1773, and he moves to Venice. And Venice is known as hotbed of vice and scandal, so this shiny priest from a small town is promptly corrupted, and he has multiple affairs. One of the most notable ones is with Angolia Tiepolo. She was his mistress for many years. She was very hot-headed. He gets into a bunch of gambling debt. He gambles like there's no tomorrow. At one point, he convinces Angolia's brother that he is Rumpelstiltskin and can make money appear from nowhere, and it's a time in his life. In 1776, while he's still living in Venice, he writes a radical religious poem. We're in the swing of the Enlightenment, so he was very enlightened. He wrote a radical religious poem that got him into some trouble. He was sent to trial, and he was cast out of the priesthood. He was no longer qualified to be a Catholic priest in the state of Venice. But he remains in Venice, and he becomes well known for this because scandal propagates notoriety oftentimes. And he ends up working for the Beladavis. Yes. And he's tutoring their children in this house. But he promptly begins an affair with the wife of the house, Angioletta. And she's notorious, and she's had many affairs in her lifetime. But this one is slightly different because Lorenzo shows her proof that her husband has been cheating on her, and so she agrees to elope with him, but there's a wrinkle in this plan because she goes into labor with da Ponte's child on the gondola that they're escaping in. Like, as she gets on the gondola, because they're in Venice, to escape, she goes into labor, and it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. So they live in sin for a while, and he has 3 more bastard children with her. And eventually, he's charged with adultery and tried and banished from Venice for 15 years. This is in 1779. He can't return. He's been cast out. So he moves to Vienna. So in Vienna, this is where his career really takes off. In the first couple years of being there, he meets his rival Cassetti, and he meets Salieri, and it's a fun time, and he writes poems, and he's tutoring in Italian, and he doesn't speak a lick of German, so it's kind of hard to do that. In 1783, though, he becomes the poet to the imperial theaters. The imperial theaters were a nationalized theater funded and run by the government. So he's appointed by Joseph II, who is the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And it's an insane position. It's very sought after. Everyone loves it. And it's amazing that this Italian embroiled in scandal, who's never written a libretto before, gains that position. But he's sponsored and supported by Joseph for much of his important part of his career. So now this is where he meets Martin, another composer that he loves a lot, and he writes his biggest commercial success, Una cosa rara, and that goes really well. And this is also when he meets Mozart. Yay, the important one. And he, in rapid succession, within like 2 or 3 years, he writes the libretto for Marriage of Figaro, and then Don Giovanni, and then Così fan tutti, like one after the other. And it's Mozart. And none of them are super big hits at the time, but they all are like, wow, look at that. Mozart can write now, because he hadn't really written a bunch. He had written a couple small things when he was like 19 and 12, but he hadn't come out with any operas in a while. And this is like, oh, wow, look, he's an operatic composer, and la 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 la, and it's a whole thing. And he approached Mozart, and he wanted to write librettos for him because he saw that he was talented, and also he wasn't a super big name, so it was kind of a safe bet. And it's amazing. However, in 1788, Joseph II dies. He dies, so Lorenzo loses his patron, and it's very sad. And the successor, Leopold, does not like him very much. Così fan tutti comes out 2 months after Joseph is dead, and it's not a success because it's a comedy, and people aren't too jazzed about that when their emperor just died. So he's been given a letter of recommendation to go see Marie Antoinette and get hired by her. But it's 1788 right now, and things aren't looking too hot for Marie Antoinette. So he gets a layover in Trieste, where he marries his wife, Nancy Ann Grawl, he remarkably remains married to for the rest of the time, and is remarkably faithful. And like, they're married for 40 years, and it's kind of remarkable considering his sordid past. So then they move to London, and it's rough. And then he moves to London in 1793. He gets the gig at the King's Theatre, and that's a good gig. Then he writes for them for a while, and he's very domestic, and he has like 4 children. And he works there for a long while until he's fired in 1800, and he opens a publishing company, but that goes under, and he has 6 children now, and so and he's like getting arrested for outlying debts he has, and it's a problem because debtor's prison exists now. That's why we have Australia, and he's shipped so he flees to America to get away from the debtors looking for him. So he opens a grocery store in New York, excuse me. He opens a grocery store in New York, and it's a fun time. It is not very successful. He has another kid. The next big thing that happens to him happens in 1806. He meets Clement Moore. Some of you will know him as the author of A Night Before Christmas. He's a big-time American scholar. And he asks De Ponte to teach him Italian and Italian literature. And De Ponte is, of course, happy to oblige because he's broke and he's running a failed grocery store. So, he starts that, and he opens the Manhattan Academy for Young Gentlemen. And in 1811, he becomes an American citizen, and then he moves to Pennsylvania, Sunbury for a bit. And then he moves back, and then Nancy dies, and he becomes a professor at Columbia, the first Italian professor ever at Columbia. And then he opens the first Italian opera company in America ever, the first one ever to perform Italian opera in America. And it's the New York Opera Company. And that also fails because he's just terrible at running businesses. And then but the theater that he built for that company becomes the National Theater in 1839, and that later goes on to be the Met. He dies in 1838 and is buried in Queens. He's still in Queens today. Yeah, that's the whole life of Lorenzo da Ponte, an insane life full of adultery and grocery selling. He's a publisher, and a librettist. He never knew anything about music. He was just a poet that wrote to music. Yeah, that's my guy. That's Lorenzo da Ponte. Yay.